Aloha, everyone. I'm Mark Levin. I am the director of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Japanese Studies, and I am thrilled to be here for our first seminar of the year and excited for our speaker's generosity of her time and thoughts, and for you all for coming. The webinar world brings you in from all around the world, which is an incredible thing. So we want to wish you all aloha in whatever place, and I should add time zone you may be in. The Center for Japanese Studies is celebrating 100 years of Japanese studies at the University of Hawaii. We are proud of that. We think we haven't finished our homework yet, but we think we are the oldest and largest center for Japanese studies, or at least Japanese studies program. We really value the diversity of the academics and research that we are able to offer in the social sciences, the humanities, languages and literature and linguistics, and our professional schools. As well, for many years, we've had a program of the Crown Prince Akihito Scholarship, and Jennifer is a beneficiary, and in a moment, Gei Satsuma, the associate director of our center, is going to tell you more about it. And that is what's making today possible. Besides that, making today possible is Tori Tanigawa in her first debut as our graduate associate for one of these programs, new on the job. My colleague, Professor Giuliazzi, who has been at our faculty for many, many years and really built an exciting theater program centering on Japan. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to my colleague, Gei Satsuma, Dr. Gei Satsuma, the Associate Director of our center. So enjoy the speech, the talk, Monstrous Wives, Murderous Lovers, and Dead Wet Girls. And we're all going to learn a lot today. Aloha.
Hello, everyone. We're delighted to host Jennifer today for our talk. And I would like to mention that she received the Akihito Scholarship in 2017, 2018. And the Crown Prince Akihito Scholarship Foundation is accepting applications for the 2022-2023 academic year. So if you're a UHM graduate student, it is exclusive to UH Manoa graduate students, US citizens. I encourage you to go to their website. It's www.cpassfoundation.org, or you can also send us an email, cjs@hawaii.edu, and we'll direct you to their website. The scholarship is one of the most generous, to be honest, in Japanese studies. It's worth a total of $45,000 for a year of study in Japan. The applications are due November 3rd, 2021. There are 2 screening interviews you're required to do, but those are through Zoom. So I encourage you to apply, to consider the scholarship, if not this year, in future years. And I wish you all the best. Let me now ask Professor Giuliazzi to do the introductions.
Aloha mai kako. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter where you may be tuning in from, thank you for joining us today. I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today and then fielding questions following the formal presentation. Our speaker today is Jennifer Yu, a current doctoral candidate in the Asian Theater program in the Department of Theater and Dance at UHM. She's currently in the final stages of writing her dissertation, which coincidentally, or perhaps not, has the similar title to today's presentation, Monstrous Wives, Murderous Lovers, and Dead Wet Girls, Examining the Feminine Vengeful Ghost in Japanese Traditional Theater and Horror Cinema. Jennifer completed her BA in East Asian Studies at Wellesley College, after which she spent 2 years in Japan on the JET program. Then she entered the UHM Master's Program in Asian Theater. In her first year at UHM, she was awarded 2nd place in the Edward Seidensticker Prize for Best Graduate Student Paper on Japan at the SPA's Graduate Student Conference in Asian Studies. And in her 2nd year, She was a regional finalist at the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival for her one-act play, Firehorse, which had recently premiered at the Earl Ernst Laboratory Theater. She matriculated into the Asian Theater doctoral program in fall of 2016. And that academic year, in addition to writing her prospectus, preparing for comprehensive exams, editing a performance guide to Kyogen, serving as the Asian Theater graduate assistant, she also trained intensively in Kyogen and performed in the play Futari Daimyo, which was part of the Power and Folly Japanese satire for the 21st century Kyogen production in the spring of 2017. As was mentioned before, she was a Crown Prince Akihito Scholarship recipient for the 2017-18 academic year. And then the following year, she received the Center for Japanese Studies Fellowship. And she spent 2 years conducting field research in Kyoto in affiliation with the ARC Research Center at Ritsumeikan University. Though still maybe young in her career, Jennifer's already presented 10 conference papers, published 2 book reviews, worked on 3 large-scale productions, written and produced her first award-winning play, worked as a food tour guide in Japan, taught Japanese language, history, and culture online, and in spring of 2021, offered a really fascinating and successful graduate seminar, which was entitled Gender and Ghosts in Supernatural Japan, Stage and Film. And that was at the UHM Department of Theater and Dance. So like many in theater, Jennifer can transform easily, and I think transformation will be a key tenet of her talk today. So without further ado, let us welcome Jennifer Yu. Take it away, Jennifer.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Julie. I'm going to go ahead and sort of dive right in here, but as is indicated by my title that was introduced so wonderfully, this project of mine, this doctoral dissertation, I've been examining the prevalence and development in portrayal of the female vengeful ghost, or I use the Japanese term onryō character type that is found in Japanese theater forms no and kabuki, as well as in Japanese horror cinema. So in this talk for today, before I dive in with discussing portrayal, I would like to provide a bit of background context, talk a little bit about the sort of theoretical framework I used to consider portrayal, as well as give a little bit of some extra background information on what an actual onryō is defined as well as the prevalence of the female onryō as seen that I'm looking at in this project. Then I will go right in and talk about what actually the onryō, the female onryō presents as. In my research, I defined the female onryō into 2 major types, which I refer to as the classic, which is found in pre-modern literature and no kabuki, as well as the new female onryō, because as is mentioned before, I was looking at cinema, and especially in J-horror, the character type is similar, but there's some things that are clearly different, and so that's why I use the term new, and I will be concluding with some just ruminations on what I consider to be the effect and influence of this character type in media, as well as some potential recent developments and concerns about its portrayal or continued presence. So to start with, for the theoretical framework, I largely reference Barbara Creed and what she calls the monstrous feminine, which refers to how women are commonly represented as weak in horror cinema, except when presented as the villain, in which case they are portrayed as almost always inherently evil. She expands on this by illustrating a connection or affinity between woman and monster, acknowledging them both as potent threats to vulnerable male power. I also take into consideration Julia Kristeva's concept on abjection, focusing on how horror emphasizes the boundaries of humanity and that through maintaining that boundary, the monstrous is thereby constructed. According to Kristeva, abjection is refers to the human reaction by which the abject, defined as that which disturbs identity, system, or order, is radically excluded. Creed also draws on Kristeva to describe how patriarchal society separates the human from the non-human, suggesting that anything that crosses that line is considered other and thus abject, and that the monstrous feminine effectively represents either a rejection of that order or at least a blurring of those lines or boundaries. So these are the two major concepts that I really look at portrayal through. As some background, since I'm using some Japanese terms today and to give a little bit of overall context, the existence of onryō can be traced back as early as the 8th century in Japan. It's commonly held even today that the deceased still retain a connection with and an interest in the world of the living, colloquially known as konoyo, which can interfere with their moving on to what is referred to as onryō. As the literal meaning implies, rather than some concrete spatially oriented afterlife, the onryō is simply that world over there, which lends it a sense of closeness to the world of the living. In keeping with this belief is the onryō, which Yamada Yuji defines as a spirit of one who, after being oppressed and driven to an unnatural or violent death, curses the one who wronged them, sometimes bringing about calamity to society at large. So this is roughly the definition that I use to approach the analysis of portrayal in both theater forms as well as in film. According to Tendai Buddhist priest Jien, however, not all onryō are created equal, as an onryō was only as powerful as its reason for appearing. Although earnest belief in onryō may not be as prevalent today, during ancient times and the medieval ages, fear of onryō was both pervasive and entrenched in society, which might explain their prevalence in Japanese literature and theater with a marked focus on the female's narrative. This popularity of the female in ghost story literature is believed to increase over time, as records indicate that before the Muromachi period, which was roughly like 14th, 16th century, that male appearances were more frequent. But it is estimated that this change came about around the time of the Oni War, with an increase of approximately 2.5 times as many female appearances in literature compared to male. This trend evidently continues through to the Edo period. The telling of kaidan, which was a term used for ghost legends or supernatural tales, became a popular pastime, leading to their wide dissemination. The most popular of these kaidan featured women, as is evident by the 3 great kaidan of Japan, being all stories that not only have been told and retold for centuries, but all feature female ghosts. On the topic of this prevalence, though, this prevalence of female ghosts in literature and by extension in theater and in film has often been attributed to women's so-called primal nature. Archaeological evidence throughout Japan supports the presence of early shamanic traditions in which women in Japan were recognized to be the natural intermediaries between konoyo and onryō. As women were believed to possess such a close connection to onryō, however, they were also considered especially vulnerable. Heian period literature often depicted women as particularly susceptible to spirit possession as a result. As contemporaneous society sought to restrict the power of women, however, concepts of gender pollution eventually fused with Buddhist ideas of female sinfulness, resulting in a, for lack of a better word, a demonization of the feminine. This association of women with an inherent demonic or oni nature has persisted throughout history and may explain how women's jealousy became such a common trope in medieval literature as well as no plays. Rather than simply a jealous woman, however, she is depicted as something far more frightening and uglier, as she is often transformed by her quote-unquote evil thoughts into a kijo. This association extends beyond fiction to even later Japanese religious customs, such as the tsunokakushi, which literally functions to hide her horns, and became common practice in Shinto weddings beginning the late Edo period, kind of implying that all women have sort of this inner nature that can pop out at any point. The female onryō persists into Japanese cinema today. Of the films that I surveyed for this project, nearly 70% featured the female onryō as the primary or sole antagonist of the film. In my dissertation, I considered changes in portrayal within cinema over time as well as theater, as there are 2 distinct periods of cinematic horror in Japan, referred to as kaidan films and J-horror films respectively. Before this talk, I will be focusing on what I refer to as the new female onryō, as I mentioned, in the more contemporary J-horror films, because it's a more starker contrast of how she compares to the traditional or classic female onryō. Okay, so on that sort of note, I would like to dive kind of in talking about First, the classic female onryō and how she is portrayed and found in pre-modern literature and traditional theater. I won't be able to cover all of which I discussed in my dissertation, but for both the classic and the new female onryō, I analyzed her portrayal in terms of 3 styles: narrative, visual, and enactment, which is how I also organize my points of analysis. For today, I will be focusing on those I've highlighted in red, beginning with characterization within narrative style, comparing the classic female to her male counterpart. Compared to the male, the classic female onryō is characterized as the more dangerous and destructive. In the no repertory, they are among the most violent characters, the ones who aim to commit or who have in the past committed murder, such as the Lady Rokujo in the no play Aoi no Ue, who attempts to murder the principal wife of her former lover. Male onryō, on the other hand, are rarely, if ever, violent in no. Even when they are, the force of their violence is often portrayed as more subdued. In some cases, a male ghost one would expect to be violent and vengeful does not even manifest as an onryō as part of the narrative, such as in the play Atsumori, where the young samurai's spirit is shown to seek friendship with and prayers from the one who murdered him rather than vengeance. When considering this violence, or lack thereof, it is worth noting that typically male onryō in no are the spirits of fallen warriors or nobles, while female onryō are more often wives, lovers, or young women. It can be argued that this distinction between the male and female is perhaps because historically men in Japanese society have had more opportunity for violence while alive, whereas women, who are more often restricted to the domestic sphere by their lower social position, can only act on violent impulses as spirits. Even during the Heian period, when noble women who arguably enjoyed the most power in pre-modern Japanese society were present, they were still restricted to the private aspects of court life. Males, on the other hand, have always enjoyed higher positions of power and perhaps are thus less unfulfilled in death. Furthermore, male onryō are often shown to be motivated by honor or some kind of political disgrace. In contrast, almost all female onryō, especially in the no repertoire, are shown to be motivated by jealousy or passion. While her motivations are often viewed as steeped in Buddhist attachment and thus sinful, at the same time, the nature of those motivations is implied to confer a particular strength. Female onryō in no are consequently often shown to require a full-blown exorcism to try and appease them, whereas simple, earnest prayers can be often enough for male onryō in no. In Funabenke, for example, although the sea becomes completely overrun in the play by souls of dead samurai, and the leading general onryō emerges to attack the one most instrumental in their defeat, with simple prayers, pretty much all the spirits are appeased and dissipate. Even when an exorcism takes place in a female onryō's play, this is sometimes shown to be ineffective against the force of her resentment, such as seen in Kanoa, in which the woman cursing her ex-husband actually becomes so fearsome that even in the play Abe no Seimei, who is considered the greatest exorcist magician in Japanese folk history, cannot fully defeat her. Julie sort of mentioned this about transformation, but the concept that rage can distort, even physically transform a spirit, especially a female one, plays a large role in the plot of the onryō's narrative. As indicated by this traditional popular saying, okori wa tsukeru, fukureru, tataki wa naku, korosu wa bakeru, which is make them mad, they sulk, hit them, they cry, but kill them, they change. It implies that it's to be expected that a woman's resentment or means of revenge over abuse received will often involve some kind of transformation of the female. As a result, many kaidan of the Edo period have instances of women suffering resentment so intense that they transform into an animal, most frequently a snake. This use of the snake in Japanese literature predates the Edo kaidan, found as early as the 11th century, such as with Kiyohime, who inspired the no play Dojoji. In the original story, Kiyohime transforms into a massive 40-foot-long snake so that she can cross the Hidaka River to pursue the young monk who rejected her. She then proceeds to coil her body around the bell he is hiding under and burns him alive. We can actually see this transformation enacted in the actual no play Dojoji, which makes reference to the bell here. So I will go ahead and play that. So I'm going to talk about how visually this transformation is portrayed in a moment, but I'm going to first more concentrate on the sort of narrative aspects of transformation, but try to keep these sort of images in mind for later when we're discussing visual portrayal. But snakes are found throughout Japanese lore. However, the feminine snake, particularly as is found in Dojoji, has a Buddhist connotation associated with the sins of women regarding jealous attachments, as indicated by the presence of, say, female-specific Buddhist hells, such as Futame Jigoku, where jealous women are turned into serpentine monsters and tormented for being such. Typically, however, female Ondio's transformation involves a destruction or at least a distortion of her image, often emerging from a scene of violence. This is especially found in kabuki works, which often feature some form of masculine violence that serves as a catalyst for the woman's transformation. The use of violence to destroy her image forcefully casts her into the abject and consequently outside all social restrictions. By being made this other, she is free to circumvent that which oppressed her. However, this comes at the cost of being transformed into the monster, barring her from both participating as well as re-entering human society. In some cases, however, this act of violent destruction is done willingly by the woman herself. The original story of Hashihime, which serves as the inspiration for the no play Kanawa, which I mentioned briefly before, tells of a woman who, overcome with jealousy, prays to be turned into a kijo for revenge. She then disfigures herself as part of a ritual, making her appearance so fearsome that those who see her literally swoon and die. Having sufficiently destroyed her image, she is free to act and gains the power to exact her revenge. However, having become a demon or monster in the original story, Hashihime later is shown to suffer from her decision of giving in to resentful passions. Male onryō, in comparison, do not undergo so violent or dramatic a transformation, if one even happens at all. Most often, they appear almost exactly as they did in life, their image largely unscathed. It can be argued that this is because, as the male body does not signify the history of objectification or commodification that the female represents, a male cannot be objectified in the same way a woman can through violence, be it self-inflicted or not. Additionally, plot-wise, water is in some way or another associated with many notable characters who emerge as onryō. This association with water harkens back to both Shinto and Buddhist beliefs, both of which place a heavy emphasis on purification, often using running water as a primary instrument. In Japanese Buddhism, the ritual Nagare Kanjo uses running water to purify the spirits of women specifically turned ubume, spirits believed to be suffering in another female-specific Buddhist hell known as Chino Ike Jigoku, being both polluted with death and blood, as well as the sin of having died in before or soon after childbirth. It was believed required to perform the specific ritual using flowing water for such a woman to be saved. Furthermore, water is used in both religions in Japan as a means to delineate the fluid boundaries between konoyo and anoyo. In Shinto, according to scholar Akima Toshio, there is literary evidence to indicate a belief in a primary access point between these two worlds called the Unasaka, where ocean currents come together to flow down the Unasaka, the slope of the sea, toward Anoyo. In a similar fashion, the Sanzu no Kawa is the way by which the dead cross over in Buddhist belief. But this strong association with water as essentially a conduit for anoyo can in turn explain when onryō appear, the site of their haunting is often near a body of water. In a number of cases, it is the same body of water that also served as the site of their death or corpse. In the original Kaidan, which also served as inspiration for the kabuki play Banshu Sarayashiki, for example, the servant girl Okiku, as portrayed in this art here, is drowned in a well after being framed for breaking one of her master's prized plates and rejecting a covetous manservant's advances. In Shinto belief, death is a form of both physical and spiritual pollution, and stagnant water is especially associated with this view. So considering the belief in the existence of flowing bodies of water like the Unasaka, the use of still bodies of water as haunting sites can be better understood. Water that is not allowed to breathe or flow, trapped from reaching the Unasaka, is ripe for supernatural activity. So in narratives like Banshu Sarayashiki, the effect is accentuated because Okiku's body is left to rot inside the well, her death further polluting the already still body of water, effectively trapping her spirit in konoyo. The last element in terms of narrative style I want to discuss is how the female onryō story tends to end, giving the sense of the implicit purpose of her narrative, which is often to censure her actions as socially adverse. Having fully embraced feelings of jealousy or resentment, she is often portrayed as corrupted by that passion, rendering the woman incapable of achieving enlightenment. At no point is her behavior condoned as part of the narrative, and sometimes she is directly criticized by another character. But in the case of when the onryō is male, if the cause of his resentment has been brought upon by a woman, her culpability instead becomes the focus. And yet, in a lot of female onryō narratives where the culprit of her torment is male, there's rarely a part of the narrative where that is present for the male, where he is censured for his actions that wrought her suffering or shown to reflect upon said actions. Thus, her story is utilized more as a moral lesson, for the audience may sympathize with the female onryō, but they're not encouraged to empathize or adopt her feelings for themselves. Moving on to visual portrayal, the classic female onryō's transformation is often visually represented in no, utilizing imagery pertaining to snakes, largely in reference to the narrative element of transformation. The most prominent example of this is the use of uroko in no costumes meant to evoke a serpent's scales. This pattern is strongly associated with and used to denote the supernatural, or at least mad feminine in no, not just the female figures who explicitly transform into serpentine monsters like in dojoji. The implication thus being that women all have a sort of inner snake to them. This is supported by the foremost use of uroko in this manner being on the inner robe, referred to as the haku, which we see in this photograph taken here. In addition to snakes, her transformation may visually evoke a demonized or oni-like feminine. The features of the Hanya mask are meant to represent a jealous female demon, which differs from masks used for general ghosts and even male onryō characters. It is most notably used in plays in which a human woman is overwhelmed by resentment and transforms herself into a demon. Though a demon, she is still very much a woman, and a tortured one at that, though. The classic female onryō, who undergoes a destruction of her womanly image through her transformation, in this Hanya mask, we still see vestiges of her femininity still remain, as indicated by her hair patterns or the expression in her face. A Hanya mask can therefore be interpreted as a physical manifestation of the perceived innate demonic nature of women as a whole. This can be compared to the Namanari mask, which is used in no to express a woman about to become a demon, primarily used to perform plays like Kanawa. As the mask carver Kitazawa Hirita described in an interview, the Namanari and the Hanya mask are both strictly female masks, and we can tell this because the actual size of the mask itself is identical to that of any other woman mask in No. So despite these dynamic protruding features of the horns, because of the size, it's implied that the horns grew out of the mask from within. In kabuki, the female character's destruction of image or transformation visually takes the form of some more literal physical disfigurement, usually incurred through violence. This disfigurement, or at least distortion of the woman's image, typically entails a removal to some extent of her femininity, the most common manifestation of which being a literal marring of her face or loss of hair, or sometimes both. Perhaps one of the most famous kabuki examples of this being the play Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, in which Oiwa is physically disfigured through poison due to her villainous husband Iemon, wherein she loses both part of her face and her hair. In both cases, this distancing from or removal of her femininity frees her from the pressures of having to maintain that femininity in society, allowing her to fully act out her vengeance. On the topic of hair, however, the female onryō's hair is often through which her actual nature and power may be better understood. This association with hair is one that is distinctly feminine and is rarely, if ever, attributed to male onryō. Lafcadio Hearn attempts to explain this as because the hair of the Japanese woman is of all her possessions that which she would most suffer to lose. While a woman's hair is regularly associated with her femininity, it also is naturally imbued with her sexuality, often resulting in its eroticization in literature and art. The act of brushing hair was considered highly titillating from as early as the Heian period. In kabuki tradition referred to as kamiski, this term was used to denote a scene in which the deep passion between a couple was conveyed by having the woman comb out the tangles in her lover's hair. Rather than as an expression of passion and devotion, however, in kabuki plays such as Tokairo Yotsuya Kaidan, the act is appropriated as an expression of power, as Oima brushes her own hair on the verge of becoming an onryō, and in a way perverts and objectifies this highly feminine act, which we can see in this video clip here. So in this scene, we saw not only is she losing her hair, but at the end, she actually is squeezing the blood out of her, that collected in her strands of hair, which further makes the scene that's supposed to be something alluring and attractive and almost erotic as something kind of horrifying and maybe a little bit repulsive in those ways. Historically, though, Japan has considered hair to be something that was much a social symbol. In a lot of ways, both men and women's identity socially was measured by their hairstyling. But in the case of women, in addition to her social identity, it also represented as much her sexuality, and thus something that needed to be contained in a lot of ways. And so keeping the hair from being left undone was strongly recommended, as hair left undone or down and to be tangled and such implied eventually unconventionality, if not instability or madness. Eventually, this association ended up extending to the supernatural in Japan. A couple scholars have different theories, but one certain scholar named Ogata Toru cites the Chinese belief in the soul thought to reside inside the head, i.e. the brain, being able to pass through the soft part of the skull, or the senmon, and travel along the hair and out the body, as the possible reason how hair left exposed or down became thus associated with ghosts and those who could commune with them. If the potential power, be it sexual or supernatural, hair contains is taken into consideration, visual expressions of resentment and madness by women through hair can be better understood. Many kaidan of the Edo period consist of women whose secret feelings towards one another reveal themselves at night through their hair, or in some cases helps express the resentment she harbors towards those who maybe have murdered her right before she dies. Finally, in terms of enactment, the classic female onryō's enactment often takes the form of removal of or distancing from femininity through these movements. In No, this is accomplished through acts of disrobing and revealing of her haku, that innermost robe. While there is often a hint of this uroko pattern haku worn under the folds of the female onryo's costume, in the first half of a given No play, only after she has come out fully as her vengeful self does she shed all pretense and bears her haku for all to see, which we saw in the video clip of Dojoji, where she shed the outermost layer of her clothing, and we saw the red and gold haku, uroko haku. At the same time, though, while loss of clothing was considered tantamount to being stripped of one's dignity and proper sense of self, there's also something titillating about the sight of a woman who has cast aside all sense of propriety. As No performer Oshima Teruhisa shared in an interview regarding costuming, to go out with just a haku which was basically an undergarment, is pretty erotic, comparable to lingerie or underwear, and notes that this is perhaps why the act of exposing the haku is rarely, if ever, enacted by male characters. At the same time, however, though provocative, through her act of disrobing, the female onyo also increasingly sheds signs of her femininity, thus giving less of an impression that the character on stage is a woman to be identified as such. In a similar vein, this removal of femininity is taken one step further in kabuki with the actual casting of actors. Playwright Tsuruya Namboku IV, who is the writer of Tokai no Yotsuya Kaidan, is credited for revolutionizing the use of female onyo characters in kabuki by choosing to have what were referred to as kaneru yakusha take on his female characters instead of onnagata. This shift towards these all-around performers who are capable of playing multiple role types allowed these onyo characters to freely act out their aggression, becoming direct agents of vengeance by directly committing acts of torture and murder to satisfy their thirst for justice, or even openly expressing their grievances. In so doing, however, by assigning these characters to performers that were not the onagata, whose goal was to strive to enact the ultimate feminine ideal on the kabuki stage, it thereby highlights how non-feminine the actions of the female onryo are. So that was the classic female onryo. I would like to move on to talk about now about the new female onryo and how she compares and how this character type is found portrayed in contemporary J-horror films. As I did with the classic female onryo, I analyzed portrayal of the new female and organized my points of analysis under the same three styles, focusing on how specific elements differed from the new to the classic. And that has made it much easier to identify what has and has not changed within the archetype overall. Like before, I won't have time to discuss all points, but we'll focus on those I've highlighted in red, beginning again with narrative style, discussing characterization and plot. One particularly striking difference in characterization is, unlike the classic female, rather than be attributed to the nature of her motives, J-horror films tend to portray the female sex in of itself as more supernaturally fatal due to some natural affinity, often manifesting in her having some form of preternatural powers, even before she fully transforms into the new female onryo. Not only is this new female frequently shown to possess supernatural abilities, there's also the presence of psychic female characters in general, many of which are protagonists who later become onryo themselves in the film. This contrast with the classic female onryo, where she often gains powers as part of the narrative through her transformation, shows that the new female portrays a different kind of woman, one who often lacks explicit reasoning for her prowess other than perhaps that she's just female. While women in Japan have had a history, as been noted, of being associated with a natural affinity for the supernatural, the focus of these films are more on the public exhibition of this femininity, which is often discouraged within the narrative plot-wise of the J-horror film, as characters who do so are described as creepy or strange, and even persecuted as a result, usually a cause for later becoming an onryo. A key example of this can be found in the Ring or Ringu series. Sadako, the main character, female onryo of that series, exhibits psychic powers, and fear of those powers result in her being cast down the well by her adoptive father, which actually serves as the impetus for her curse as part of the film. Even normal female victims are shown to be quite sensitive to the supernatural, not just ones who are explicitly psychic, with numerous J-horror films featuring instances in which they receive some sort of vision, often revealing some truth regarding the female onryo herself. While this may be in reference again to associating the feminine with innate supernatural connections, it perhaps in these films has more to do with the ability of the female victim to sympathize with the new female that threatens her as a fellow woman. This in turn, however, often results in her being more vulnerable and susceptible to being possessed by the new female onryo, even contracting her curse and being made a monstrous feminine herself. In addition to demonstrating a altogether strong propensity for violence, because definitely in J-horror films, the violence is kind of keyed up a little bit compared to classic portrayals, the new female onryo is often characterized by that violence herself, even more so perhaps than her classic counterpart. Most of these figures are portrayed as having suffered abuse of some kind, frequently, though not exclusively, at the hands of a male character, and often in response to be behaving outside what is expected of her social role. These are just some examples here, but a notable example comes from the Grudge franchise. The main new female onryō in that series, Kayoko, is brutalized to death by her husband Takeo, who suspects her of infidelity. Despite being victims of abuse, in life, however, they often become abusers themselves because there's almost a senselessness to these new female onryō as they seem to lose all ability to reason. Even when they themselves are victims of abuse, she does not pause when faced with others who might share her story or hesitate or show mercy. In so doing, she's very firmly cast in this villainous role that is lacking of sympathy. An added plot element in narrative portrayal of the new female onryō is the tendency to use technology as a new conduit for the supernatural. Sometimes in addition or in place of water, the new female onryō often makes use of things such as screens or cell phones to traverse onryō into konoyo, as indicated by many of these J-horror films being referred to as techno horror. In the case of the Chakushin Ari film series, the vengeful female spirits that feature in that film franchise directly make connections to the victims through the cell phone. Upon receiving a call, then a voicemail or message on their phones foretelling their demise, the new female onryō's curse is transmitted. But much like how a computer runs the risk of contracting a virus by accessing the internet, the curse of the new female similarly takes on a more viral threat to the living. In the case of Chakushin Ari, after a victim dies, according to the voicemail or message, the next target is called, chosen at random from the last victim's contact list. So rather than an explicit target for her vengeance, like with the classic female and her motivation for being, victims in most J-horror films unwittingly fall prey to her curse and can even pass the curse along. This often too leads to a lack of resolution within a given film, as this new female of J-horror films often presents closer to a force of nature rather than a single individual that can be reasoned with. Thus, the new female presents as more of a monster and less of a woman if comparing her to the classic counterpart. As noted before, this viral, even contagious nature of the monstrous feminine and her curse can also result in victims being transformed into the new female onryō like herself, regardless of whether the female character being targeted shares similar circumstances or not, which also harkens to that maybe connection or implication that it's just them being female now and it doesn't have to do as much with circumstance. When looking at visual portrayal, given the heightened emphasis on violence, it may come as little surprise that unlike with the classic that might transform into an oni or snake, the new female's transformation into an onryō is visually expressed almost exclusively through physical disfigurement. In both the case of the classic and the new, the purpose of removing her from femininity by transforming her image does remain the same. But unlike with the classic portrayal, which might be more figurative or stylized, the new female's image is almost exclusively altered through literal physical disfigurement, often reminiscent of the violence she incurred right before she became such. It should be noted, however, that I noted before that the male onryō often don't have their image altered. This kind of stays the same in J-horror. Male onryō are very rare in J-horror, which is one of the reasons why I didn't really analyze their presence. But when they are present, they're largely unaltered, as is the example of Takeo. The husband who killed his wife in the Ju-on franchise does actually emerge as an onryō himself. This is an image of him right about before he was killed by Kayoko, and this is how he actually presents as an onryō. So he really doesn't show much change in this case. Hair also is often shown to be a key feature of visual portrayal, and this is often used almost to further obstruct or distort her image by almost depriving her of a face. Many films feature scenes of just bursts of hair inexplicably appearing and relying on that to suggest the supernatural presence as well as increase the sense of discomfort for the audience. Oftentimes this hair is somehow connected to the female onryō's presence, but sometimes this hair just emerges completely disembodied from her presence itself, and it thus deprives her of any sort of semblance of a face. And so her image is not just distorted or obstructed, it's actually rendered invisible, because the added effect of this is due to lacking a clear identity by being attached to somebody's head, maybe. The hair of the new female onryō that appears can be actually conflated with all women's hair, thus objectifying the physical trait altogether. This objectification or othering of women's hair is evident in some J-horror films taking the hair visual element and utilizing it as a direct implement of the new female onryō's will, fully embodying her resentment for the living by using it as a weapon to actually haunt, ensnare, and even outright kill victims. In these cases, on a slightly more amusing note, this trend is apparent in J-horror franchises that started maybe with not that strong of a concentration on that, such as in these more recent Sadako 3D films that were connected to the Ringu or the Ring franchise, where Sadako appears increasingly more connected to hair by using hair to trap or attack her victims. In fact, the special edition box set for this film featured a box with just hair coming out of it in that way. Although not a physical trait directly associated with her body or image, the use of water, or at least wetness, is frequently utilized to similar effect in J-horror films as hair to visually represent the new female onryō. In some J-horror films, we can see the original connection to water, such as in Ringu, where Sadako's body was found in the well, much like the story of Okiku and Banshu Sarayashiki. Or there are other films that make use of water as a conduit to bring back the living, bring back the dead from onryō, using water as that vehicle. But more recently, there are films that actually use water to represent the onryō herself. A very notable example is in Honugurai Mizu no Soko Kara, also known as Dark Water in English, where her presence is manifesting more as just water. But this is not just any kind of water. In keeping with the original associations with water, this is often water that is somehow polluted with, say, death or dirty in some way. And this also connects to these new female onryō kind of made wet with things other than water, such as other bodily fluids, such as blood, oftentimes in this case is associated maybe with motherhood or birthing. This is indicative in the term dead wet girls, which was first coined by a film theorist by the name of David Collott to use to attribute to female ghosts as present in J-horror films specifically. On the sort of last note on talking about enactment, the full impact of the new female onryō is much like with the enactment of the classic female, focusing on alienating the audience, but rather than distancing her from femininity, it's more dehumanizing her altogether. This is present and implied by the inspiration of most of the movement as found in J-horror films being sourced in Buto, which was a dance form that was created in as a direct assault of preconceived notions of socially accepted standards for Japanese aesthetics and refinement by inventing a dance form that effectively dehumanized or deconstructed the socialized body. This is implied by the quote made by Hijikata Tatsumi, one of the founders of Buto, that Buto is a corpse standing desperately upright, which may explain its attraction and unnervingness to the audience in these ways. Additionally, there is the lack of voice. Oftentimes, the use of dehumanizing sounds is used at most to underscore enactment. So these characters are often deprived of virtually any opportunity to speak. In the case of Kayoko from the Ju-on franchise, she is actually incapable of speech because her body has been brutalized and her neck has been broken. So she lacks that ability to voice herself. And so she's left to rely purely on sounds, which is the sort of last enactment trait that is very distinctive of J-horror, is relying more on what might be referred to as soundscaping, focusing on those sound effects rather than a full-on soundtrack, which we can kind of hear and also see the movement in this clip of Ju-on. So this is giving the basic idea. I don't want to run out of time to be able to talk about some concluding thoughts, but in this clip, you could hear maybe her death rattle at the beginning. And so that is a major feature of her presence, oftentimes through the sound, but also the way her body moves. But you can kind of hear that it's not really a soundtrack so much as the focus is on like the squelching noises of her body. So those are the things that I was referring to when I meant focus of soundscaping versus soundtrack. But in closing, considering the female onryō begs the question of what her image truly represents. And I would argue that rather than a liberating image, it's more of a controlling image. Being depicted as monstrous, as onryō, these women can escape patriarchal society, but women and women who feel powerless and oppressed like these characters, it may serve as some form of a release from the frustrations that they experience in life. But these characters, to gain power, have to destroy themselves. And in so doing, they lose ability to garner sympathy because they have to effectively turn themselves into monsters, transforming themselves from victims into the villains. And thus, they're made into the abject because while women in the audience may feel potentially some vicarious vindication, the woman spectator is encouraged to reject rather than emulate these female onryō because of the way that they are portrayed. Turning her into more of a controlling image is my sort of argument in that case. But as the popularity of Japanese horror cinema has increased, trends unique to these cinematic renditions have developed. Most notable of these is a transition away from a more grown-up onryō to a younger adolescent or child. Oftentimes in the case of a child, the main onryō as the main onryō does not have to necessarily be female, which is somewhat promising in those senses of having variety of portrayal. However, there are other developments that indicate maybe some different motivations, such as a rewriting of the classic female onryō herself. This is evident in some recent modern adaptations of kabuki plays, such as in Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan. This production done by Sunoaka Produce actually portrayed the villain Iemon as a sympathetic character and even cast Oiwa, the vengeful ghost, as regretting her revenge and being sad over his death. So these changes, not entirely sure what the full implications of those can be, but those are things that are definitely observable. The last potential concern that I have is that portrayals of the female onryō are increasingly reducing what used to simply evoke or reference into a full-on trope that defines the archetype as a whole. As indicated by the term dead wet girls, it's making it more a checklist than a really character type that has a lot of richness that the classic originally had, as is sort of indicated by this poster here of the most recent Sadako film. We have the hints of a well and hair, and that's all we need visually. It's almost like, is she dead? Yes. Is she wet? Good. Is she a girl? Good. We've got a J-horror movie. And that's very different from how the onryō archetype originally presented. So all in all, this image should arguably no longer be relevant or necessary. So changes are good, but the continued propagation of this image in these ways can potentially be harmful. So I'm sort of stressing, or I'd like to stress that consideration when it's being utilized in film or in theater. So that's basically the last element I wanted to discuss. So thank you so much for listening. And I understand that now we're going to get time for thoughts and comments and questions. Yes, so I can stop my share here, I think. Here we go.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. That's wonderful. I have a lot of comments myself, but I would like to invite the audience, now that you have a little moment to think and type, because there was a lot packed in there from Jennifer in a very short time. To please go ahead and take a moment to type your questions into the Q&A on the bottom right. There is one question already here from Jared, who is asking if you have any reading recommendations for those who are researching Ondio.
Do you have any reading recommendations? So a lot of my resources on the onryō were actually in Japanese. So Japanese language wise, Yamada Yuji is considered kind of an authority on the onryō. He's written several books that were literally called Onryō to wa nanika, which is what is an onryō, and he's officially sort of defining it in that way. In terms of English sources, I'm a little bit blanking on some sources. A number of people have translated Yamada Yuji and reference him in some ways. So that is sort of a way if language is a bit of a barrier in that case. If I think of another source in English, I will mention it. But right now, those are the sources that I'm mostly focused on using in my research, researching those cases. One of the interesting things to note on that topic, though, is most research of the onryō has been focused on the public concept of onryō. So the belief in onryō was this focus on pacifying these resentful spirits that were publicly acknowledged as such. So I mentioned that the 3 great kaidan of Japan all featured female ghosts, but the 3 great onryō of Japan are all public male figures. So a lot of the onryō research is more focused on that side of it, as opposed to the female onryō who shows up maybe more in cinema, media, literature, and such. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's another question here from Lindsay. And in analyzing, I think this might be part that you didn't have time to address in your talk. So now is the opportunity. I mean, analyzing the female onryō in Japanese cinema, do you distinguish between kaiki eiga, which are maybe closer to kabuki and no narratives, J-horror, Japanese horror, and J-horror? In a lot of early English language writing on Japanese horror, these categories are sometimes lumped together. But Mitsuyo, Wada, Marciano, Chika Kinoshita, Stephen T. Brown have argued for J-horror as a much more specific category in terms of themes, aesthetics, and time period, even if it shows the influence of kaiki eiga and kaidan narratives.
Certainly, yes. So I didn't get to talk about that here, but yes, I do make a distinction in my research and make I use the word kaidan films because kaiki eiga as a term also included films that featured supernatural, monstrous creatures from other sources. It is in the cinematic history. So when films about Dracula and Frankenstein were imported to Japan, they called those kaiki films, whereas films that were domestic were almost exclusively referred to as kaidan films. So in my research, I refer to them as such, but I do make a distinction, and that's sort of a transitory phase between the classic of the pre-modern lit and the theater into what is largely considered J-horror, because most people would recognize that J-horror didn't really emerge until the 90s. And so there's a large span of time, starting with when films really first started being made in Japan until that point in which horror-esque, it's maybe difficult to call it horror because it also wasn't really acknowledged as such. On the topic of Mitsuyo Wada Marciano, she herself acknowledges that they didn't actually define those films during that period as explicitly horror. So actually referring to them in that way is maybe a little tricky, but I do make that distinction. And so there are more elements that that sort of transitory phase shares with the classic than with the new that I discussed today.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you. And this is a question from Josh Rogers. Is there any differentiation between onryō and yurei in either the pre-modern or modern sources you look at? And do Western ideas of ghosts or other monsters impact modern representations?
Okay, so onryō technically would be considered today a category of a yurei, which is a little tricky because the term yurei comes from after the onryō word, but today in a lot of sources they would consider the onryō a sort of category of yurei. So in later folklore texts, especially published during the Edo period, they kind of altered the organized breakdown of both the yokai, apparitions, and yurei. So technically speaking, an onryō would be considered a type of spirit, and thus yurei is referred more to as the general term for spirit in that sense. Do Western ideas of ghosts or other monsters impact modern representations? That's an interesting concept. I have said this before, but I didn't say it officially here. I actually don't like horror, so I don't know a whole lot about like Western horror that much. I find it intellectually fascinating, which is why I'm studying it for my research here, but I'm not that familiar with Western horror, other than say Gothic horror, which I studied more to see the influence of, say, transitioning from the kaiki or kaidan films into J-horror. But that's a really interesting question. I would say that more modern representations are just propagating and repeating the initial new female onryō that showed up, and just referencing less and less of the classic in those cases, is what I would say. But it's a really interesting, provocative thought on the development of horror for certain.
Okay. There's another question asking if in your research, as you read Koji Suzuki's original Ringu, if Sadako's intersex nature in the novel plays into your reading of her being presented as an onryō in visual adaptations. Okay, and what of her becoming cisgender, in the mainstream film adaptations?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So I don't know how many people. That's a great question. Yes, I do consider her their original portrayal. For those who are not familiar, the Ringu franchise was inspired off of a novel referred to as Ringu, written by Koji Suzuki. Yes, in the novel, she's portrayed as intersex, which is actually the reason for her rejection. So a man character becomes attracted to her, thinking that she's a woman, realizes she's intersex, and actually kills her as a result. There's also the element, though, in the novels, is that she actually has an STD in it, and so her sort of status as having a sexually transmitted disease actually manifests as part of her curse, which explains why it's viral. So that's an element that actually got reintroduced into the J-horror films later. But in the original Ringu, they sought to divorce it as much as possible from those elements in the original first film that Nakata Hideo made. But later films focus on that. But what is interesting is they don't return to the intersexness of her identity, and they kept her as cisgender in that way. So that still persists, but those small novel elements do show up. Certainly, I think, given the time period, that informs a lot. The first film, Ringu film, was released in 1998. And when the novel was released, it was highly controversial, highly problematic when it was released. So that may have been also a motivation for that. But it certainly has had a huge effect on portrayals. I remember quite distinctly having an interview in Japan with this scholar when I was on my field research, and the person, when I shared what my concept for my research was, this scholar responded by saying, I mean, women are scary. Obviously, that's all there is to it. So I don't see what more there is. And so that sort of implies that impression that's been propagated in a lot of ways. And definitely the Ringu film had a huge effect. Most people will say that the dead wet girls trope or term was introduced through the presence of Sadako as specifically a cisgender female onryō figure.
Okay. We have another question about our dead wet girls here. So, and this is Jujun Ma asking if you've looked into the ritual religious context of constructing the featuring image of onryō and dead wet girls in earlier periods. Says, I'm curious if there is any element that was originally attributed to ghosts or demons in ritual contexts in general, but was more gendered and attributed to female ghosts in narrative images.
That's really interesting. So I referenced this a little bit about talking about studies or research on onryō. The belief in onryō is that sort of the one that I quoted with Yamada Yuji. So in terms of ritual and religious beliefs and such, there is a form of a religion that emerged around the time when the onryō were believed to be very much accepted as part of society, that was called Goryo Shinko, in which the focus was on pacifying the onryō and turning it into a benevolent spirit. But most of the times, those targets of Goryo Shinko were very public figures. And so the process of recognizing an onryō as such officially was done by a religious or political authority, often supported by an oracle. And so the people that were the focus of most ritual and religious practices and constructs had nothing to do with feminine, because they were almost never included and regarded as onryō in that sort of religious public sense of it, which is pretty interesting considering how prevalent they gradually became in fiction in those ways. So as a result, though, I do believe, I would argue that because those were the ones who were publicly recognized as onryō and perhaps deserving a spirit pacification and such, to be made benevolent spirits, their motivations for being onryō were thus considered more positive, or these are okay reasons to want to have vengeance. And in contrast, the ones that were considered more steeped in, say, Buddhist attachments, mainly things related to carnal pleasures or love and such, were considered with more sinful attachments and opinions. So that might be the way I would say in terms of how female ghosts and narratives and images are often portrayed.
Okay. All right, great. Well, Don questions keep coming in, so I'm going to just keep pushing them to you, and please continue to put your questions in the Q&A. This next one is from Pier Carlo Tomasi. Welcome to the faculty. I think you're actually made it here to Hawaii. It's a new faculty in EALL. Thank you for the talk. And he said, you mentioned Buddhist background of early Ondio narratives, arguably influenced by the Japanese medieval debate about the impossibility of female enlightenment. To some extent, we might even read these no plots as a dramatization of complex doctrinal principles. So he's thinking particularly about the Devadatta chapter in the Lotus Sutras, in which the dragon princess performs a sudden change of sex and attains Buddhahood. So it's an extreme example of transformation, of course. So he's wondering, what, if any, role does Buddhism play in the later developments of the Ondio trope? Does the religious element fade progressively away towards increasing secularization, or does it remain relevant somehow? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, that's an excellent question. Definitely would agree with how its role played into no portrayals, especially with the emergence of the kaidan literature. Entertainment regarding the supernatural became increasingly secular. So sort of a precursor to the kaidan of the Edo period is often referred to as the setsuwa, which were secular, but often had some level of moral lesson, often some kind of Buddhist didactic teachings and such. And so we do see this transition steadily away from that and more secular in that case, especially with kaidan emerging as purely a form of entertainment with really no ritual aspect to it. So in later developments of the onryō trope, especially in, say, kabuki or in, say, J-horror, I would argue that Buddhism took increasingly less roles. Kabuki, you can still see some hints of it, but definitely there seems to be a more focus on the social roles of the characters as opposed to maybe their positions in terms of religion and their identities associated with that. There are a couple of J-horror films that have a religious element to it, but interesting to note, which I do make a small note of in my dissertation, is most of the focus on the religious elements have more to do with Shinto than with Buddhism in those cases. So a lot of times if religion shows up in the film, the focus is purely on those Shinto aspects. So I would say that in the case of J-horror film, I'm sure there's an exception, because there's always an exception to any given generalization or rule, that by the times of contemporary horror films, Buddhism really isn't playing any much of a role. So slowly being kind of filtered out in that way.
Yeah, I was thinking about, myself too. I had a question thinking about Buddhism and salvation, and even in no place, how often do the female onryō have attained that salvation? Whereas many of the male onryō have that release.
Yeah, no, certainly, and I actually make a note of this because in the case of Aoi no Ue, Lady Rokujo is a very highly positioned social character. In terms of her status, if you're looking at the tale of Genji, and she's the one who probably gets closest to enlightenment in that. So again, it's the sort of reference to social elements, whereas in Kanawa, she's rejected as an evil spirit, even the gods hate her and all that kind of stuff. And so she's kind of deprived of that opportunity. So definitely there's more of a focus on that in those cases. What's an interesting note, though, is that I did talk about concepts of female sinfulness in Buddhism, but that wasn't initially the case. Earlier on, there was more of a concept of that sins were naturally accrued just by living life. And so we do see that gradual transition more towards the female, even within Buddhism. But initially, it wasn't like that. So.
Have there been, this is another question from Alison Becker, have there been any recent works or projects reframing the female onryō as just for seeking revenge on their abusers or deserving of empathy for the abuse they've endured?
Ooh, any recent work reframing the woman? It's really, I can't think of any off the top of my head. So my answer would probably be if I can't think of any, and I've watched like, I've fully watched about 57 movies, and then others I sort of surveyed. If I can't think of any, then probably the answer is maybe not. But I think that is an interesting way to reapproach the archetype. As I mentioned, one of the concerns is turn it into a trope, is maybe like take the trope and turn it on its head a little bit more and use it to say something different about the woman. One might argue, though, that in the case of the example I showed at the end of rewriting the classic female onryō, that perhaps not having a character so bent on revenge and such is a different kind of positive change to show a different approach to like, say, turn the other cheek kind of idea to it. But it does sort of imply that a woman should stay subdued in those ways, which is personally not something that I would love or accept. I definitely was kind of outraged that they did that when I watched the play in person in that case.
Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, can you connect this with, maybe you mentioned just briefly that there are more horror films that are focusing on children. And does this have anything to do with, you have connected this the Ondio or in the J horror as a patriarchal way of controlling women, and this emergence of children? What might that be pointing to in?
Yeah. So earlier there was that question of like, is there any maybe Western influence of ghosts and monsters? And now that you brought up children, I might want to recant what I said about that, because definitely there is a focus in Western horror of the idea of the demonic child, like the child of Satan, or in some cases, or something like that. And so there is a possibility of looking at the presence of children, increased presence of children in J horror as maybe a reaction to that. But it's also possible to look at the trend of casting the antagonizing supernatural force as younger and younger has more to do with concerns about the younger generations that are stronger than maybe concerns about women and such. So that's a possibility in those cases, and that it really doesn't matter about the gender of the child anymore. It's just about the age. But you could also counter argue that children don't have firmly strong attributes associated with femininity, because that doesn't come out until puberty for in a lot of cases. And so that's why we have more less of a distinction between maybe choosing to have a girl child or a boy child onryō in a film. There's also the presence of just regular living children being present in onryō films, or J horror films, I should say, where they become agents for the supernatural. They get approached by the supernatural force and get sort of invited to take part and become part of the whole process in those ways as well. So that may also be indicative of that, perhaps.
Well, it's sticking with J horror. This is a question from Mire Koikari. What impacts does the genre of J horror have in the global media landscape? Are these narratives, visuals, sound, etc., female onryō adopted or appropriated by filmmakers outside of Japan? If and when that happens, is any transformation happening, such as the onryō stories becoming more explicitly feminist-oriented revenge tales?
Yeah, definitely the impact of J-horror on like the horror cinema overseas worldwide has been a very strong topic. A lot of sources, when they talk about J-horror, they're very much focused on the whole J-horror versus their Western remakes kind of studies in that case, because J-horror, certainly a lot of those films like The Ring, The Grudge, Dark Water, Chakushinari, all of these films have been remade into some kind of Western rendition, or even in other countries have made their own versions of these as well, especially in Korea or in Thailand. So we can kind of see almost in that a change of what is expected almost of horror by using that. So some people note how more American horror films are increasingly feeling a little bit more aesthetically like maybe J-horror films. But conversely, we can also see that some J-horror films are doing less of what they focused on maybe earlier with, say, The Ring or Ringu, and more being like Saw movies almost in some cases in that. So it's not one way, it's definitely being interchanged in that case. But definitely borrowing elements and such. We actually can sometimes see those presences in, say, theater. I actually watched a recent production of Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan that was a traditional kabuki performance. And they inserted J-horror into it. They actually inserted jump scares using the traditional ghosts, where they just showed up and like grabbed people in the audience. As part of that. So using that kind of almost discourse and going both ways is something certainly kind of interesting. But again, I'm not as, it is a really interesting concept to see how J-horror has maybe influenced horror cinema overall. As I mentioned before, I'm not that knowledgeable about horror beyond what I need to do for my research, but it is certainly an interesting field to consider.
Can I explore, you commented on Butoh as being a possible inspiration for J-horror, and is that something from your observations of your work, or is that something that directors have written about, or is it something, I mean, certainly the Butoh performers have probably not, it's not coming from them. So where is this coming from?
So this comes from interviews. Shimizu Takashi, who directed the first Ju-on films, directly cited that he was inspired by Butoh in a film interview when he created the films. He also invited a Butoh dancer to help train the actor who portrayed Kayako. So she was encouraged to mimic some of the movements. She didn't have to straight up be a Butoh performer, but sort of take that embodiment in herself when she was portraying in that case. So that's where I sort of imply that. In the case of Nakata Hideo, though, the actual actor who played Sadako in the first Ringu movie was a Butoh dancer. So they actually cast, well, I guess they really just hired her just to show up for the scenes that she showed up in, because she really didn't have a huge presence in the film other than the climax. And so they did actually cast a Butoh dancer to move in those ways. So that's where that largely comes from in the case of those two directors who have directly cited inspiration or have utilized the form in their works. But some film scholars of horror, Japanese horror in general, have interpreted that as perhaps also taking inspiration from Butoh, or maybe taking inspiration from Shimizu Takashi and Nakata Hideo, who used Butoh to utilize in their own films. So it's true that beyond those two examples, perhaps other J-horror film directors are more being inspired from the thing that they got inspired off of, as opposed to Butoh itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I follow up a little bit with the technology as a replacement for water, which I found kind of intriguing, because in a sense, it is a connection. You know, we have this physical world, and then there's this technological world that exists in this other realm, you know, konoyo and anoyo. When does that when does that begin in J-horror? And where do you think it can go? And how does it really connect with, how might the Ondio use that? I'm just asking to project a little bit here.
Yes. So, I mean, the concept of what's often called as techno horror and the idea of technology like radio waves, the internet, it's all this invisible field. So it's maybe very compatible with the concept of konoyo and anoyo. Anoyo is sometimes referred to as the invisible world, also for those same ideas. And so the association with technology, most people will point to Ringu as the first one, because in Ringu, Sadako curses people through a videotape. People who watch the videotape, they die within 7 days of watching it. And so that is where the curse is transmitted, by watching this screen and such. If people were reading the novel, though, it's more having to do with contracting it through the eye. So the focus is actually more on sight in the novel, but definitely in the film, the focus is way more on technology, in that as being used as the medium for that. So most people will point to Ringu as being the first film, which was released in 1998, to be one of the first major films that had a huge influence on that. There are a couple of films that utilized technology before the release of Ringu, but the credit is often attributed to Nakata Hideyo's Ringu in that sense. But increasingly more technology is being used almost as a way to make the onryō more relatable. So for example, in the Ringu franchise, as they progressed in the films, nobody's scared about a videotape anymore, because who has a videotape? Who has a VCR? And so Ringu, the Sadako curse, goes online. In the later films, she becomes a cursed YouTube video. So there is that sort of progression in that way, in terms of having that connection to the audience and having that sort of closest relatability in that way. But it's also kind of this sense of expanding beyond a very limited field. Like in the case of Ringu and Sadako, it was just one videotape. It was just that one videotape in that case. And then going from that to the internet is perhaps a sign of the expansiveness of her power in some ways, the potential limitlessness of the female onryō in those concepts. Because definitely, you could argue capitalism, I guess, in some ways is the reason why the franchise never ends and she never stops. But you can also argue that that has more to do with the transition of the new female onryō as being one that's not really so much a woman with a very distinct purpose, and more so this monster that will come up every time, much like how Freddy and Jason will show up no matter what.
Mm-hmm. You had a quote early on about the onryō is only as powerful as its reason for appearing, and it seems that the onryō is becoming more and more powerful at the same time that the reason for appearing may not be as easily identified. Yeah.
Certainly. When Jien, this the Tendai Buddhist priest who wrote about onryō in his text, was referring to this, he was referring to more the public concept of the onryō, in terms of how people who have suffered political disgrace are the types that will bring down lightning onto the emperor's palace style kind of explanation, compared to onryō who might just curse one person and to sickness and death. But certainly this idea of lacking a clear reason is almost the unknowable, the unknown reason, the unfathomable clear reason is maybe also the source of the more new onryō's power. Because in a lot of cases, especially in J-horror, there's not often a clear reason. In some cases, some are just, they think they have the reason, but it's not enough in some cases. Or there isn't one ever explicitly stated at all in such cases, which might connect more to the idea of Jien's statement about the onryō being only as powerful as its reason. So actually lacking a reason or a clear human level fathomable reason is the strongest an onryō can be, which actually, that's an interesting concept of maybe why children onryō are more powerful or more found present now. That just popped into my head thinking about it, because children often don't have a clear agenda in a lot of cases in those ways. So that could also be an interesting extension of that.
Well, we will leave everyone with these thoughts. I would like to thank Jennifer for the talk. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Those of you with long hair will probably think differently about your next bad hair day. And I will turn it over to Mark if you want to say some closing words. Thank you all for attending today.
Mark, I can't.
No, no.
Oh, there we go.
I tricked you all. We have kicked off this year wonderfully, and I want to thank Jennifer for taking the time and launching us into such exciting contemplations. Once again, the audience from around the world, it's really amazing. I noticed we've got Europe, we've got Asia, we've got Latin America, we've got all over North America in the registrations, and of course, not to mention right here at home in Hawaii. So that's really exciting to see too. We hope that we will be able to continue doing more. But I also want to thank Julie, Professor Yezi, for her bringing us together, Gay and Tori, and also the foundation that has made the Akihito Fellowship possible, because Jennifer was probably launched by Manoa, our theater department, but we got her sort of, out of the stratosphere and beyond with that award. And so that's really such a special thing for what we were able to do here for our graduate students. So aloha to everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you.